Welcome to Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast. Join the Podcast Mogul Phil Better as he interviews successful entrepreneurs that make their living in the digital world. Now, let's join your host, Phil Better, and his special guest today on Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast. Enlightening episode of Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast, hosted by myself, Phil Better, the Podcast Mogul. Today we have a guest whose expertise in finance and property investment is changing lives. Our guest began his journey in the finance and lending industry at the very young age of 19. With a passion for helping people break free from the debt trap, that's a tongue twister, he has dedicated his career to showing others how to leverage property for passive income. As a mortgage broker, property investor, and host of the Debt to Financial Freedom podcast, he offers a wealth of knowledge and practical advice to optimize finances and achieve financial freedom. So listeners, without further ado, let us introduce our guest of the hour, Victor Lagos. Victor, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Really happy to be here.
When you first reached out, or your team reached out for you to be on the podcast, I was very excited because you're doing something that others aren't doing. You're flipping the script, if you will, on how to create passive income, because most people think they need to have, multiple of websites for that passive income, but you're doing it completely differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, property in itself is, I think around the world, most of the wealth is held within property.
Uh-huh.
But what I found is that most of the know-how is also kept with those that own most of the property.
Uh-huh.
So I've been on a mission to learn more and more and teach what I learn and learn from others, other professionals, other investors, and I help my clients the best way possible.
What made you decide to get into this realm of entrepreneur? Because, mastering property investments and all that, it's a little different than what other people are doing when they're starting their own business or starting their freedom trip.
So it's because of my own personal journey. So you mentioned earlier that I have a podcast called Debt to Financial Freedom. And my personal journey professionally is that I got into financial services when I was 19. And just for context, I'm now 37. So that's, 18 years now?
You're nearly 20. We'll call it 2 decades. You've been in the game 2 decades.
About 2 decades, yeah. But my personal experience was actually I was in debt at a young age as well. So I'm sure it's like this in a lot of other countries, but in Australia specifically, I was 18 years old and I was working full time at a supermarket, quite a large chain. And that was easy enough for me to get a $12,000 personal loan and a credit card from a bank. I walked in and they approved me on the spot. And that was sort of the journey. By the time I was age 20, I believe I was probably in more than $20,000 worth of unsecured debt. So I've had an interesting relationship when it comes to debt personally, and then professionally, I've learned more and more how it works on the inside, working for financial institutions. And my parents were property investors, but they were very novice and they didn't have good help along the way. I was able to see that while I was working and still living with them. And unfortunately, through their experiences and lack of knowledge and lack of genuine guidance, they were taken advantage of because of the great Australian dream of having a home and setting the family up. And basically, long story short, because of that, their relationship to money, because of not managing their debts well, and because of not having good help, they are now in their late 70s. They are on welfare and they are renting, and literally they don't have much money to their name. And it's quite sad because I know how hard they worked. I've got 2 older brothers and they worked really hard along the way. They both, my dad had his own business as a tailor. My mum was a legal secretary and executive assistant. So they were earning reasonable money. And at one point they even had, nearly 3 properties. So for all that to come undone, that's sort of put me on this path of how do I actually help others so that never happens to them. And there's an absolute most chance of return and very, very little chance of risk. And yeah, here I am today.
I love it. I love how you took a negative, if you will, from your youth and turned it into a huge positive, both with the fact that you had the debt situation, which I think is a crime that banks give that much money to 18-year-olds who have no idea the dangers, if you will, of handing so much money to an 18-year-old. Let's be honest. Most 18-year-olds shouldn't be handed more than $100. Um, not the wise people. But when did you start shifting? Because you said you were in heavy debt when you were 20 years old,
Yeah.
in your early 20s. When did you realize, like, oh shit, this is not good for me. I need to
Mm.
change my situation.
Yeah, it's I wouldn't say it was like a one click of a moment where I was like, okay, from now on I'm gonna change. I think it's been a bit of a love-hate relationship and a bit of a you know, it's been multiple experiences that have kind of kept me on track and put me ahead and put me behind again. But what I would say is one thing that clicked for me early on was when I read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad. That was in my early 20s, and I understood the concept, of building income producing assets and reducing liabilities, and understanding what is good debt versus bad debt. And good debt is basically debt that allows you to grow your wealth and it's tax deductible, and bad debt is debt that is not tax deductible, and it's typically, when you're wanting instant gratification, you're wanting a feeling, you want something now, it's not for the future, right? And what happened was I knew about credit. So in a lot of countries, credit score is very important. Australia, it hasn't been as important compared to the last few years, but your credit file or your credit history is still very important. And no matter how much debt I was in, I've always protected that score. I've always protected my credit history, and that's helped me to get more and more debt. And it's actually quite weird because at one point I saw credit cards when I was really young, I saw credit cards as a bit of a trophy, because it felt like if I could get money from banks, it kind of adds to my self-worth, right? They say, oh, you're worthy of a limit, credit limit increase, or you're worthy of a American Express card. It's like, oh wow, like it feels, yeah. At one point, I actually had 5 credit cards. Um,
Whew.
yeah, yeah. But look, I wasn't as silly. Like, yes, I would use the funds, but I never cash advanced. That's the thing. A lot of people, get stuck. I never went to an ATM and took money out um, from a credit card. I actually played the game where I would use one credit card provider to pay out another for a lower interest rate to keep my repayments low and pay less interest. um, so I think what really shifted for me was when I met my wife. That was about 8 years ago. So 2016, I started my first business as a finance broker. I'd been a finance broker for working for someone else before that, and I actually was able to start that business with debt. I got a startup business loan from a bank, and I actually I put together a business plan, but I didn't really know what I was doing. Right, I was I didn't have any experience running a business, and I wasn't the best with money, so I was using the debt to fund that business, which is fair. That's what you do with a startup business loan. But it didn't take me long where I accumulated more outgoings than incoming. So so essentially, I was at a point where my debt ran out, and I didn't have enough clients to come through the door. I had a fancy website, right? I had videos, but I also had all these commitments. So I started paying for courses and people to educate me on how do I operate a business, how do I grow a business, what do I need to do. And everyone who I was paying, they were operating their own businesses, so they were obviously happy to collect my money, right? Um, so that was big learning for me. But when that, I actually had to shut that business down because I wasn't able to continue. I needed to pay for rent and things with my wife. And that's really what shifted for me, is because I had a bit of a rock bottom. We had a rock bottom to an extent where we didn't actually have enough money for rent. And that was the first time it sort of really hit me. And I was like, no, something really has to change here. And what happened was we sat down together. We printed out our transaction histories. We had a joint bank account. For about 3 months, we went to a park. So we got out of our regular environment and all the normal habits that you would do and distractions. And we brought a piece of paper and a highlighter, and we started highlighting every single expense that we had and categorizing it to understand, like, where is our money going? How much do we actually spend? And we started to stick to a budget, but a budget that wasn't restricting us. I heard of the concept of bucketing your money into different buckets, essentially. And because of my knowledge in finance and understanding how to set up automatic transfers, we really started to change the way we looked at things and started putting money aside for the future. And we started living off of, much less, because we realized we didn't need to actually live off too much. And that changed everything. We were able to save up $100,000. I started working for another mortgage broker. I was on commission, and then I also got a pay increase. And then we bought our first property, and then we bought our second property, and then I started this business, in my current business, in 2022, so 2 years. And now I'm also starting 2 other businesses. So yeah,
Just feel like you didn't have enough on your plate already. You decided to do more.
Coming from multiple podcasts to Phil.
Coming from someone who has multiple podcasts, which must say is it's probably about the same headache as running multiple businesses. I want to know, with you established something with how you got out of the debt trap with your wife, was printing out your bank statements, highlighting what are good, what are bad, expenses, if you will. Is there other strategies that you would recommend for individuals, apart from, like, the basic printing out your bank statements and seeing where your money's going, that they can start kind of like break free from the cycle of debt, if you will, and start building finances through property? Because property obviously is one of the major needs, right? We all need housing or comfort, if you will, and housing brings that. What other strategies do you have for people to start that journey?
So there's lots of strategies, but I think what it starts with is having a mental framework of why you're doing it. And I think that's what shifted for me. So we talked about, putting money aside and categorizing it, but that sounds quite boring. And for most people, they're probably not going to do it unless there's a framework for them to comprehend that. Like, why would I do that? And what helped me is to realize that every time I spend on credit cards or borrowed money, and a big thing that's going on at the moment is called buy now, pay later. All right, there's a couple of big players, Afterpay, ZipPay, and huge others, Clara, all around the world. It's massive. And I've never got into buy now, pay later, because that came after I learned my lessons. But what I can say is, every time you use money from debt to cover your expenses now, you're actually stealing from your future self. And that's what changed for me, because if you imagine you want to get, say, a brand new mobile phone, and it's going to cost you $1,000, but you don't have $1,000. So you put it on buy now, pay later. And you say, I'm going to pay it off in 6 installments, or I'll put it on credit card and I'll pay it over time. You get to enjoy that phone right now. So it's instant gratification. It's like, great, feels awesome. But we all know that feeling fades away very, very quickly, right? After maybe a few days, a week, it just becomes another thing. And you no longer get to enjoy the feeling of having something new and all of that. So then your future self has to pay for it. And your future self is like, oh, thanks, past self. You got to enjoy all the feelings. Now I got to deal with this and I have to pay it back. And then you have this negative feeling that you're paying back something. And at the end of the day, when you're paying for something, there's an exchange. So it shouldn't be a negative feeling. You're benefiting, all right? But it creates a negative feeling, this loop in your emotions and in your thoughts about money and about what you use that money for, because you've stolen from yourself. So, but on the flip side, if you were to put money aside and so not look for instant gratification, but look for delayed gratification, it actually feels good because you're putting money, it feels better, I should say. You put money aside, say every week, say $50 a week, and then over time that increases. Eventually, you're actually giving to your future self. So eventually, you have $1,000 and you buy that mobile phone. You may not even buy that phone. In the end, you might end up deciding, you know what, I'm going to get something secondhand and get something for $600 and keep my other $400 to give to my future self for something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then your future self says, thanks, past self. You've looked after me. Now, right? Now I own this phone outright, right? I don't have any debt. I get to enjoy the feeling for as long as possible now because I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's mine, and I can use. And now you've created a habit as well. So you've put away $50 a week, and now you continue paying $50 a week, but now you're giving for something else. Now you're saving for a property, for example, a deposit, because you obviously want to buy something bigger and better that's going to give you a return in the future. So it shifts the focus of how do I have, what can I do now to give me more later? And also the understanding of leverage, right? So leverage is the other piece, that if you know that you can use your deposit or your cash to leverage the money from the bank, essentially using the terminology OPM, which is other people's money, you can turn your 100,000 potentially into a $600,000 asset, right? So you put 100,000 down, and well, let's make it $1 million, depending on your borrowing capabilities or your capacity, but let's just say it's $1 million. So the framework is, if I have $100,000, everyone's heard about compounding interest and things like that. That's, compounding. If you put 100,000 in the bank and say you get a 5%, let's say 10%, you get a 10% return at the end of that 12 months. If you don't take out your earnings, you'll have 110,000. If you leave that 110,000 in there, you now get a return on 110. And then over time, you get 10% on 110 and then 10% on 120. But on top of that, there's that compounding amount on top, right? So you understand that over time, it gets larger and larger. But the return on your capital is always based on 100,000. So by leveraging the bank's money, by leveraging the tax deductibility, by leveraging rental income that you generate from the investment property, which will cover most of the interest. It used to cover all of it. Now it's a little bit negative because of interest rates. But you could essentially turn your 100,000 into $1 million asset. And if you do that well, your return is not on 100,000, it's on $1 million, right? And the bank they're essentially a business partner with you, but they're not wanting a percentage of the profit. That's the difference. If you do that well, all they care about is getting interest and fees, right? Pay the interest and fees, and most of that is paid from either your tax deductibility. So this is your some of your pre-tax money that you can actually use towards that, as well as the rental income, which is paid by the tenant. So you're providing housing for somebody or a family. So it's a win-win-win scenario, right? As long as you structure it well, the tenants are now paying majority of the interest. The bank's getting their interest and their fees. The tenant's getting a house. You're getting less tax, and you're controlling and you own $1 million property. And if that compounds at 10%, now what's 10% of $1 million? 100,000, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
10,000. Sorry, 10,000.
Yeah, it's listen. It's money. I'm not a math guy.
More.
It's much more than
let's put it in. 1 million times 10%. Sorry, it is 100,000. It's
Yeah.
100,000, right? So you've essentially, if you get that return, right, which is possible, it's not guaranteed. There's no guarantees in this game in property, but if you do it well, there's a very good chance you could get 100,000, which is 10% return. So that means in 1 year, technically, you could actually get your return on capital, right?
Yeah.
Because of the power of leverage. Those are the couple of frameworks that I sort of want to put out there, because by understanding this, it gives people, or gave me a reason to actually work towards something bigger and give to my future self. And now I'm reaping the rewards of it. Slowly but surely, it's growing and growing. And then, yeah, it's a change in mindset. So that's what I would recommend. And of course, there's the whole personal growth. So if you're wanting to understand different strategies, it's all around, self-improvement, right? If you believe, there's so many different strategies you can learn, but you need to believe that you can achieve these goals that you set for yourself. And I've been on this journey. Someone I've followed early on was a fellow Canadian, was Bob Proctor. I I think he was a really good man. He's passed away now, but a lot of his learnings I've applied. And he learned stuff from reading Napoleon Hill's Rich Dad Poor Dad. He learned from Earl Nightingale, so I learned some stuff from there as well. But yeah, that's what I would say.
I love it. When did you as a podcaster, I have to ask this because it's my bread and butter. When did you decide that a podcast would be beneficial to Lagos Financial?
So when I started my business in June 2022, I invested straight away into staff, which is sometimes counterintuitive, right? You typically want to have enough clients and enough capital aside. But I at that point, I had nearly 5 years experience working for another broker. And I realized that, one, I knew I was good. I had a lot more experience. I knew I was good at what I did. And I knew that I would get a lot of clients. So I wanted to prepare for that. But I also knew that there was there's a couple of fundamentals that you need to have in check for a business. One of them is you need to have basically clients coming through the door, right? That's number one. You need to have a system to market yourself and to sell your services and convert clients. So basically, you need to have that, like a machine where clients come to you. And typically that comes from referrals. But because I wasn't able to generate any referrals straight away, because I wasn't able to take any of my past clients. That's what happens. I honored that. I started from scratch. I invested in support, which the next part is having people. You need people to help you. Otherwise, you're doing everything yourself, wearing every single hat. And it's impossible to scale. And if you try to do it reactively, you have less time to hire because you're so busy trying to fulfill. Yeah. So I hired someone straight away. And then another part was systems. So I started to build out my processes and systems, because that's another fundamental. A business is good as its systems, people, and of course, your ability to acquire new customers. So towards the end of the year, that was probably around October, I was invited to a party, a boat party, by one of my referral partners, and I met one of his other referral partners, which is another broker, who's actually he's my business partner now on a new business venture. Yep. He told me that he had a podcast and that he used this company to do the videography, basically. So I set up a call with them probably about a month later in like November 2022. And it was an investment, right? Like basically the structure was, you commit to two episodes a month, and that was $2,000 plus GST, so $2,200, and you record them back to back. And all I have to do is basically invite a guest. This was face to face. This is when I was living in Sydney. and I'd just have to interview them, and they would record everything professionally, and they would do the audio, and they would edit it and put it into small, snippets or shorts. And then they had a separate cost to do the distribution, to put it out in the socials, which was like another $1,000. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to do the distribution, but I do want the podcast. So I had some experience with a virtual assistant, and they said if you bring on a virtual assistant, a VA, that they'll help train this VA. So to do the distribution across the socials. So I had a trip booked to Europe with my wife in December, and we're going for a whole month. And we recorded 2 episodes in November, and obviously I need to get it out to the to the internet. But I was away, so and this is what also I started learning early on, the power of using other people's expertise, right, and getting consultants essentially to help you do things rather than teaching you what to do and then you having to do it. So that's what coaches do, right? They try to guide you on what to do, but you have to execute. Where I prefer consultants that actually implement. And that's what they did. While I was on the trip, they actually trained the virtual assistant that I brought on board virtually on how to do it. And while I was traveling, he was getting feedback. And in January 2023, the first episode was posted, and that's continued on. It's obviously evolved. It's no longer live. It's not sustainable to pay that sort of money ongoing. It's now virtual, and now I do different series and interviews and things like that, and I'm doing a little bit more solo. And it's been a year and a half now of doing podcasts, and that changed my business big time. Like I can tell you a bit more after.
Oh, I have no doubt how it changed your business, being a podcast, right? It's a lead magnet, lead generator. It's everything you need, authority builder, and that's one of the reasons I have so many podcasts, because I love podcasting, and I get to talk to amazing, interesting people like yourself, Victor. I do have a question, because we are looking at investing in ourselves, and it has been a kind of a theme in your story so far, hiring the right people, knowing the right people to talk to, talking to mentors and that. And Bob Proctor, a huge mentor in the mental mindset game. I'm curious, what you would suggest, what you would view as your most crucial investment in yourself, and something that can help others ensure a long-term success if they look at investing in themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you have to explore your own curiosity, because there's so many different methodologies and different teachers. And I personally don't like looking at people that consider themselves or put themselves in a guru sort of position, where they want praise. That's something I would probably steer away from. I've never looked up to someone like Grant Cardone. I don't look up to him. There's people, even Gary Vee. I know some people really like Gary Vee. So you got to go with people that resonate with your persona and with your values and principles. But that was probably one thing I would say, is just follow your curiosity and what resonates. But I think probably the thing when it comes to investing in yourself, for me, it's kind of been not applying what I learn and looking within myself. So when I say looking within, it's like, what does that actually mean? Well, it's actually switching off distractions, right? Putting off social media, putting off TV, anything that's going to put, even like dedicating certain time for yourself. So for me, for example, at the moment it's not even 5 a.m, but sometimes I would be up at this time anyway, and I would sit with myself and meditate, right? And I don't meditate where I try to switch off all my thoughts, right? A lot of people meditate to try to quiet the mind and switch it off. I actually meditate so that I can find out what's going on inside and make peace with it. Because it's up to you. Like there's going to be external influence all the time throughout the day. Like, keeping busy with work, keeping busy with, other people and everything. But when you put all that energy and attention on yourself, you're able to then, uh, for me personally, I'm able to process emotions and basically gather myself or recenter myself and understand myself at a deeper level. And I think that's, it comes to self-awareness. If you're wanting to make change, if you don't know how you operate, then how do you expect to change for the better, right? So I think that's, I can obviously go into more and more detail, but that's probably how much I would say is like, find more about you, what makes you tick, what are some of the emotions that you're carrying, and find different methodologies that allow you to process those emotions. I've created my own framework that I follow, and I'm happy to share that with you if that helps.
Well, maybe that could be a future episode. Don't want to give all the beans away in the first episode. We need to have Victor come on again. Victor, we are coming close to the end, which I hate because I'm having a great time chatting with you. I find that you're a breath of fresh air in the financing of housing and that, because I've had a few people on who live in the real estate world, and I love how you're more of a breath of fresh air coming in and helping people. With that, my final question is, I have your 10-year-old self here, Victor. He's very chatty. He hasn't stopped chatting the whole time he's been here, but I'm wondering, what's one piece of advice you would love to hand back to your 10-year-old self?
Yeah, good question. So if I was talking to my 10-year-old self, I would say, embrace that you're different. Don't feel like you need to fit in. It's not about everyone else, you fitting to them. Be who you actually are and explore that to the best of your ability.
I love that advice. That's great advice, Victor. I think more people should embrace who they are as a 10-year-old so that they can grow to become a better human being. Victor, I'm going to jump off screen here. I'm going to give you the last little bit. Tell my audience where they can connect with you, where they can follow you. If they're in Australia looking for a great mortgage broker or a financier, that as well is up to you. But the floor, sir, is yours.
All right. So if you're looking to connect, best place to find me is on my website, which is lagosfinancial.com.au. So that's LAGOS financial.com.au. If you want to listen to my podcast, you'll find that on my website under the podcast tab. Alternatively, you can search Debt to Financial Freedom on Google, and you'll find the YouTube channel, and you'll also find me on your Spotify and iTunes as well. Thanks.
Awesome. Victor, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your story with my audience, and leaving some little tidbits for future episodes when I have you come back on. So I want to thank you incredibly for that.
You're very welcome, Phil. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
You are absolutely welcome. The pleasure is mine. To my audience, make sure you check out the show notes down below to connect with Victor. And if you are in the Australian region, maybe you can find a great person to help you finance the next house you buy. And with that, I thank you so much for listening. And remember to always invest in yourself.